This could be the hardest hitting basher of 2025, but to find out, first, we build. As you can see from the manual, we're going to start with bag A. And the nice thing about these kits is that everything you need for each step is in its own separate bag. They also include pretty much all the fluids you're going to need, though we're going to be substituting some things like the grease for this utter butter. We're going to start with the center differential. This housing is plastic, though it does have a steel insert for the output bearing. These output cups are also nice and high quality. And these internal gears, while sintered, are also very, very well made. You can see just how smooth that surface is. Sometimes sintered gears can feel pretty cheap. These definitely do not. The pins that the spider gears go on are also machined and really nicely ground. And you can see they actually have notches cut in the ends. Those notches align with the sides of the case and actually hold the pins in the proper orientation. But of course, before we put those in, let's go ahead and take this back apart, because in my excitement to get this kit together, I already forgot to put the bearing on. And we'll just pop that on there and put it back together again. And I have to say, guys, I am very excited to get this kit together. The original MT410 was my go-to basher for quite a while, and its combination of handling and durability was unmatched at the time, and I've got really high expectations for this successor. Being a basher, Tekno does specify 200,000 CST oil in this center differential, but knowing myself, I'm going to want to go thicker, so I'm going to go straight up to 1 million. I think this will be a good compromise between handling and stuntability. Just keep in mind, the thicker the center differential fluid you use, the better you'll be able to do wheelies and stunts, but the worse your steering is going to be, especially under power. You may have noticed the spur gear on this is actually made out of plastic. That's pretty normal for Tekno. They do make a steel upgraded spur, which I actually would have liked to have seen on this particular car, but they make race cars, and race cars still use plastic spurs pretty commonly. Whether or not this plastic spur is going to hold up to success is something we're going to find out when we bash it, but I do want to say this differential feels nice and smooth, as I would expect from a Tekno. The next step contains the front and rear differentials, which are fairly similar to the center differential with one big difference. And I wouldn't say that difference is necessarily these beautifully machined ring gears. These are really, really nice. The main difference is that these actually use plastic crosses for the internal gears. Tekno does offer steel pins for these differentials just like the center differential, but they've been using these plastic crosses for a while, so let's stick with this and see how it works. Don't worry though, because later we will be seeing what upgrades fit this truck, including one we're going to make ourselves. Just like with the center differential, we're using plastic differential housings here. However, these don't have the steel insert for the output, but they do go together exactly the same. We just put our O-ring in, put our bearing on, drop our shim in place, install the output cup and the side gear. And then because this cross is one single piece, we can put all 4 gears on at the same time. As you can see in the manual, unlike on the center differential, these don't use backing washers, so this will just drop right on in. And then we are going to use the recommended fluid for the front and rear differentials. That's 200K for the front and 100K for the rear. While that fluid's settling in, we can put together the ring gear with a touch of utter butter and the output cup, the steel shim, the drive pin, and then its gear. The level of this fluid looks just about perfect, right above the cross. So now we can button this up. Just like the center differential, this feels very smooth, and even though this differential is a bit smaller than what you might see on something like a Traxxas Sledge, the quality of these parts means it's going to be very strong, and I love their attention to detail. These screw holes go all the way through, which means if you get a little bit of fluid jammed in there, it's not going to cause any problems like it might on a blind screw hole. This is the differential. I put 200K in, so we're just going to mark it with an F, and now let's put the rear differential together. Exactly the same, and now we have 3 completely built differentials. And I gotta say, guys, the only thing more satisfying than the first smooth feel of a freshly built differential is subscribing to the Do RC channel, so now's a great time to do that. And now that you've made sure you're subscribed, let's move on to bag C. This bag gives us our first look at the aluminum on this truck, and this looks absolutely beautiful. This is 7075 aluminum. It measures a full 5 millimeters thick, and I love this gray anodizing that Tekno does. It looks so nice. But before we put that on, we need to get this bulkhead put together. To start that off, we're going to install this pinion. Again, this pinion is relatively small for a 1/8 scale basher, but it's also extremely high quality. The bearings fit in the plastic bulkheads absolutely perfectly. And after popping this shim on here, we can go ahead and install the input cup. One thing Tekno is known for is their oversized grub screws, and the ones for the input cups are no different. Normally you would need to clean these grub screws before installing them to get manufacturing oil off, but I bet this one's already going to be clean. And yep, as you can see, basically nothing came off of that. That's just some really nice attention to detail, which means this grub screw isn't going to fall out on you, which is one less thing you'll have to fix when you're out bashing. This is the front bulkhead, so we want to make sure we get the front differential in there. And Tekno does include shims, but they state in the manual that the shims might not be necessary. The best thing to do is just go ahead and try the differential in the bulkhead without any shims first. And while holding it in, try to move the pinion gear back and forth. See how there's a little bit of play there? We also have a little bit of differential movement in the bulkhead, so we should be able to add a shim on this side. Fortunately, Tekno has this design so you can add and remove shims without taking the output cup off. And now, as you can see, we still have a little bit of play, but a lot less. I think that's going to feel just about right. You want to keep in mind that once you put the cover on and tighten it up, this is all going to get a little bit closer together. So if you have it too close together, you might end up binding once you do. Of course, if you go too far, you can always just take it apart and take a shim out, so don't worry too much about it. And now that we're happy with how it's shimmed, let's go ahead and get this cover installed. Once you've got some tension on the cover, you want to go ahead and recheck your gears. That has gotten a lot closer together. So if we had used this other shim, it probably would be binding now. Man, guys, seeing this thing come together makes me really excited to bash it. The original MT410 was probably my favorite basher of all time. Modern advances in the competition did make it obsolete, but I've got really high hopes for this one. We've got fairly standard shock standoffs here, though again, this all looks very high quality, so hopefully it'll be able to hold up to some serious bashing. And the final step on this is to put this little reinforcement cover on the bottom. Before we do that, we'll go ahead and grease up these gears. I'm just going to use a little bit of udder butter on here. And that is absolutely plenty. This bottom cover does use the dreaded 1.5mm hex screws, and the manual does warn you to be careful putting them in so you don't strip them out because they are very small. And that's the front bulkhead done, and this all feels really smooth and really nice. Now in the D bag is going to be the rear bulkhead. The D bag is an important bag because it represents the fact that you've gotten both the front and rear bulkheads done. Because it's similar to bag C, I'm going to go ahead and do the D bag off camera. And there we go. Now the only main difference besides not needing any differential shims for this one is that the input shaft is already on here. And as you can see, this is a universal joint, and it is a very nice, beefy looking universal joint. Again, everything on these kits is top notch. Now moving on to bag E, we get into the real beef of this truck. These lower arms are absolutely massive. They're nearly completely solid, and they're some of the strongest looking arms I've ever seen on an RC car. And speaking of stout, take a look at these hinge pins. On the previous MT410, the hinge pins were a bit of a weak point. These things are a full 5mm thick, and they look absolutely gorgeous. I don't think we're going to be bending these. They're going to be attached to the truck with these C and D blocks that appear to be plastic, but they actually have a steel plate embedded inside. That's a really interesting design, and I'm curious to see how they're going to hold up to some long-term abuse. The steel should be plenty strong, though. This D block attaches to the rear bulkhead with a temporary screw. As you can see, this particular step uses 3 different lengths of similar screws, but these screws are actually full size in the manual, so you can figure out which one you need by actually comparing it to the drawing. This removes any question about which screw the manual is calling for and makes sure you get the right one. Before we install the arms, we need to install these droop screws in them. And these screws are special because they install from the bottom, but they also have a hex in the top so you can adjust them from above. This is important because once it's installed, you can't get to the bottom with the chassis in the way. And now we go ahead and install the arms, and I have to say again, these hinge pins are absolutely massive. Here's one compared to the 4mm pin you get on a Sledge or a 6S Arrma. That extra millimeter might not seem like much, but it makes a huge difference in strength. Of course, every system has a weak point, and anytime you make one part stronger, it moves the weak point to something else. What that weak point's going to be on this car, we're not going to know until we bash it, but I doubt it's going to be these hinge pins. Another weak point on the original MT410 were the dog bones and CVDs. Tekno has decided to go with U-joints on this 2.0 version. These have their advantages and disadvantages, and if made properly, can actually be stronger with less binding than dog bones or CVDs. However, the shafts on these are only 4mm. That's quite a bit smaller than the 5mm you're going to get on something like a Sledge, and I'm definitely curious to see if they'll have the same bending issues as the original one did. Putting these bearings into the rear hubs, you can see these hubs are definitely designed for racing. They come with a bunch of different adjustment pills for the top and 2 different holes on the bottom. For something that's primarily going to be a basher, I'd prefer to see solid hubs back here, as most bashers don't do a bunch of adjustment, though as long as these don't break, I guess the adjustment's nice to have. We've got these really nice 17mm hexes, and the pins that go through have flat spots in them. Those flat spots go toward the grub screw hole in the axle, and they help positively retain the pin in place when you put the grub screw in against that flat spot. You can definitely feel the racing heritage of these cars. There are no shims in this, and there's almost no play at all. The less slop you have, the better the car is going to handle, and I expect this thing's going to handle really well. One interesting thing is that these rear hubs are actually symmetrical. Usually there's some offset to them, but this is nice because it's one less part number you have to have as a spare. Being race car derived, this thing has even more adjustability, allowing you to set the wheelbase length. For the sake of strength and simplicity, I'd honestly prefer all these adjustments weren't here, though I'm sure some of you guys are going to disagree. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments. Do you want more strength and and simplicity, or do you prefer all the adjustability? Another thing you'll notice is that these outer hinge pins are quite a bit thinner than the inner hinge pins. This makes sense because in a crash, there's going to be a lot less force on this outer hinge pin. When a car takes a hit, it's going to take the hit on the outside of this arm, and the entire leverage of the arm is going to be acting on this inner pin, while none of that leverage is going to be acting on this outer one, which is why they can get away with these pins being a lot smaller. But again, these pins do feel very high quality, and I've got high hopes for them staying straight. So if the hub was the entire width of the arm, it would give it more support. Now we get to do my absolute favorite thing, which is assembling adjustable links. These links are 4.5 millimeters in diameter, and these ends do look reasonably stout. The manual does give you an actual size representation of how long the link should be. That way, if you don't have a set of calipers, you can still make them the right length. I'm gonna go ahead and do these off camera, and let's get them installed. With that, the back end is just about done, and she's looking absolutely beautiful. The front end's gonna go together in a similar manner to the rear end. As you can see, the arms are equally beefy. Of course, instead of the solid rear hubs, we actually have kingpin steering knuckles in the front. This design is similar to what you would see in a Traxxas Sledge, though there are some improvements. First of all, the steering itself is in double shear, meaning that it's captured on the top and the bottom rather than just on one side. And then instead of just using screws for the hinge points, we have these pins that go in from the top and bottom. And those pins are held in with these grub pins from the side. The kingpins themselves not having any threads on them means they can be stronger for the same diameter. And since they don't actually thread in, there's no risk of them unthreading as you use the car, like you can get sometimes with kingpins that screw in using just a screw. And just like the rear, there's almost no slop here, but it is nice and free to move. One interesting thing I noticed while I was taking the arms off their trees is how much more flexible the arm tree is. You can see how much flex there is here and how little flex there is for the plastic on the knuckles. While these are both made out of nylon, the formulations are obviously different, and that's pretty common for RC cars. Just like on the rear, the front uses universal joints, and a nice side benefit of this is that the universal joints are smaller, meaning they can actually fit right through the C-hub when you install them. That means you don't have to take this apart if you ever have to take the shaft out. Normally with a CVD style shaft, you do have to take it apart, and while that is a small benefit, it is a real benefit. Just like on the rear, the front does use oversized grub screws. This is really nice because this area tends to get packed up with dirt, and the larger grub screw socket is less likely to strip out in that case. And now the rest of this is going to go together just like the rear, including the droop screws, A and B blocks, which also have those steel inserts, those beefy 5mm inner hinge pins, the outer hinge pins, and then the front camera links, which I've already assembled off camera. I noticed after tightening all that up that one side of my steering is actually locked up. If you look in the manual, they warn you of this and tell you need to back one of those kingpin grub screws out just a little bit so it doesn't interfere. Let's see if that works. We'll take this back a couple turns and yep, moves nice and free now. With that, we've got the front end and the rear end done, and this thing's really starting to come together. I cannot wait to see what this looks like completed. The last step before beginning final assembly is to put the steering rack together. As you can see, the Arrma bar here is a stamped piece of aluminum. You can tell it's stamped because it has these kind of shiny smears on the side. That's different from this machined aluminum shock tower, which looks nice and smooth on the edges. Stamped aluminum will typically also be kind of rounded over on one edge and sharp on the other edge because it's been pushed out of a piece of metal. Assembling this is pretty straightforward. This is actually one of my favorite types of steering servo savers. We've got aluminum support structure, but plastic cams that actually rotate on each other. I found that aluminum on aluminum tends to bind up and can actually cause more problems than it solves. This aluminum adjustment nut does use a little O-ring in here, and that O-ring is designed to help prevent this nut from loosening up on its own. A 17mm wheel wrench can be used to finish tightening it. The instructions say to tighten it all the way down, then back it off 2 full turns. The instructions also want you to use thread locker. I'm gonna go ahead and use liquid thread locker for this. This is the included thread locker. That way it'll run down in there and work better than the gel that I normally use will. And we'll just take the tail of a zip tie and push it down into those threads. To be fair though, it's probably better to add the thread locker to the threads before you put the nut on. This should be fine though. Unlike most RTRs, this does use full ball bearings throughout the steering rack. This makes for much smoother steering than bushings that you'll normally see. And like everything else, these bearings fit absolutely perfectly. Assembly of the steering rack can be a little bit tricky, but as long as you're careful and you follow the pictures, you'll get it together correctly. Be careful not to over tighten this because these nuts are plastic and it is possible to strip them out. And then the last step for the rack is to install these steering links, which I've already assembled. It is worth noting that these links are pretty thin at only 3.5mm. Maybe that's thick enough. Again, we'll just have to find out. Now the steering rack is done as well, and it's time to get everything installed on this absolutely gorgeous 7075 chassis. This thing is almost 4.5 millimeters thick, which is as thick or thicker than most aftermarket chassis, and way thicker than the chassis you would get on something like an Arrma. Once we get the front and rear end installed on here, we can start on our custom part, but before we do that, I need to know the shape of this hole on this bracket, and to figure that out, I want to try something new. I got this impression paste for some dental work I had done, and I'd like to try to see if I can use this to take an impression of the inside of that hole. So we're going to take an equal amount of both parts. That looks pretty good. Mix them together, and then we're going to squish that down in this hole. Now, hopefully once that hardens, we'll have a nice impression of what the inside of that looks like. While we're waiting for that to cure up, we can go ahead and get this front end on the chassis. These two small screws are actually designed to hold this front end in place while we don't have the front skid plate on. That's actually really nice because if you ever have to take the front skid plate off, you don't have to worry about this falling apart when you do. Another nice touch that you don't get with every manufacturer are these little indentations where the steering posts go. That'll hold them in place while you install and remove the screws, which means these will never end up just spinning on you when you try to take those thread lock screws out in the future. That's a really nice touch. Now, on the other hand, this front tower to chassis brace does feel a little bit anemic compared to some other modern bashers. And now, after inserting this screw into the steering rack like the instruction manual recommends, we can drop the steering rack in place. We're going to top that with this linking plate, which I do think we'll be able to upgrade here in a little bit. But again, I want to use the stock parts for the first test just to see how strong it is. And now our impression putty is cured, so let's see how it turned out. Gonna push in from the back here to kind of free it up. Might need to push in these holes a little bit. And there we go, a perfect impression of what the inside of that looks like. We'll be using this in just a few minutes, but for now, this piece goes right here. By the way, let me know if you've already figured out what we're gonna be making out of that carbon fiber. The last thing we need to install is the front skid and bumper. I'm really curious to see how this is gonna hold up. This was a weak point on the original MT410, and I'm hoping they made it quite a bit stronger. For the next step, we need to choose our electronics. I'm just going to keep it simple with this WP8BL150 G2 ESC and this Castle 2200 kV motor. For steering, we're going to use this Savox SW1212SG. This should be a nice fit for it. As always, before you install a motor on a motor mount, you need to make sure the screws aren't too long. As you can see, these go all the way down to the face of the motor, so these will be just fine. According to the manual, for 2200 kV and high-speed running, we need a 13-tooth pinion. I think it's funny that they give a braking parts pinion size over here. I think that's a nice nod to bashers. Tekno is using a hole style motor mount here. This makes setting mesh very simple, but you run the risk of it not working properly if your particular gear combination doesn't work with the mesh that they've decided is best. I have seen that a lot of manufacturers are starting to move back towards this type of mount though, so I guess it works pretty well, though it's not my preference. Next up, the servo goes into this mount that's integrated into the chassis side pod, and unfortunately this particular servo is a little bit too tall to fit in here. So I guess we'll just have to upgrade to this much fancier 2280 SG. Obviously there are cheaper servos available that will fit in here, but this is the one I have available to me right now. The included ESC plate has mounting holes for several different brands of ESCs, including this Hobbywing. You do need to be careful though, as these holes are really shallow, and if you put screws in that are too long, they'll punch straight through into the circuit board and blow it up. And now we just install the motor. One thing worth mentioning on this is that the electronics are pretty tight in here, and a 4074 motor is about as big as you're going to go with the stock motor mount. For most bashers, I don't think this is going to be a problem, but it is something to keep in mind. Another thing to note is that this truck keeps the wiring nice and tidy, but you do need to follow this diagram while doing the installation, otherwise it's not going to work properly. A couple other things worth mentioning is that this receiver box, like pretty much anything that isn't Traxxas or Arrma, isn't waterproof. It's not a huge deal as it's fairly easy to make your receiver water resistant. And then this battery box, while reasonably sized, isn't massive, so it's not going to fit those giant oversized 6S batteries. And now we just need to install the center differential mount, along with the center differential that we assembled earlier and this really nice aluminum front drive shaft. And our pinion gear, the first of which I tried, by the way, didn't actually work with this spacing, so I had to use another one. That's definitely something to keep in mind. We can install the top covers, which fully enclose this center differential area. And now after installing the rear end, which goes together exactly like the front end, we can finally build that custom piece I was talking about, and that's going to be a carbon fiber tower-to-tower brace. Tekno does offer a brace as an option, though it wasn't available when I got this car, and I think this is one place where they kind of misread the room. This should be standard, it really shouldn't be optional. Because I don't think it should be optional, we're going to make our own. Starting from the impression we took earlier, I can measure this and see how much room we have inside that hole. Then we're going to go ahead and go into CAD, model this up. Conveniently, the length between the two holes is exactly 13 inches. Then, since carbon fiber is very expensive, I went ahead and printed one end out just to make sure it's gonna fit properly in here, and it looks like it'll be just fine and should clear everything. So now with the carbon fiber sheet loaded up, we're gonna go ahead and cut this shape out. This sheet is only 4 millimeters thick, so we're gonna cut it out twice and double it up. And here they are, guys. I think they came out pretty good. They're not perfect, but I think they're gonna work great. And seeing it installed has me really excited to bash this thing, so let's speed run through the rest of the build. Just a couple quick notes on building the shocks. You do have to drill a hole for bleeding with the bladder style cap. This cap can accommodate both bladder and emulsion style shocks, so you only get the bladder with the kit, so you will have to drill the holes. Also interesting to note is that all 4 of these shocks are identical. Typically, especially with something race derived, you're gonna have longer shocks in the rear, but these are all the same. One thing to note about installing these is on the left-hand side, use a left-hand threaded screw. This is done to prevent the screws from unthreading themselves as the suspension cycles up and down. And finally, we need to install the bumper, wheelie bar, and body mounts, which let us drop on this beautiful blue body. I think this Ford F100 body came out really, really nice, in spite of the fact that Amazon sent me the wrong body twice. I was trying to put the Chevrolet long bed body on here, and this one doesn't quite fit front to back. Fortunately, the way this truck is designed, it's versatile enough that I was able to put the body mounts to the rear of the rear shock tower, and that lets it fit on good enough. All right, guys, let's start by getting a quick top speed. Of course, being a kit, your top speed is going to be different from mine depending on what parts you choose, but let's see how it handles some high-speed runs off-road. That is not bad. It's pretty good handling. We ended up back on its wheels. Another quick run. All right, yeah, we're going to be wheelie limited here, which of course, being a short wheelbase monster truck, isn't unexpected. One more pass. Yeah, she handles well, and it is really rough over there. All right, let's get one more quick pass on it. All right, let's see what we got. There's definitely more in it if we were on really smooth ground and maybe had the center of gravity a little bit lower, but 43 miles an hour is not bad. Speaking of handling the rough stuff, handling is where these Tekno trucks really do shine. This is a short wheelbase monster truck, like I said, and short wheelbase monster trucks usually handle pretty marginally over rough terrain. This is some very rough, rutted construction site terrain, and as you can see, it's handling it pretty well. I do have to be careful on the throttle so I can actually steer it because it really does want to pick that front end up, but overall, especially for as high as I have the suspension set, this does feel really, really nice. And being a kid, of course, adjusting the suspension just the way you want it is part of the privilege. There is a ton of adjustment on this thing, and I am definitely not the best at adjusting. But again, with as high as I've got the CG set right now, it really is handling admirably. It is a little bit top heavy, but it feels absolutely great and feels more like a truggy than a monster truck. Of course, being a monster truck, it should be able to handle this rough hill pretty well. Get a little jump right there. Yeah, so far, I'm very impressed with this. Let's get a high-speed rough terrain pass. Not bad. It does seem to like to land on its wheels. That's probably because of the pickup truck body that I have on it. That cab tends to make it roll back over when it lands on its lid, which is actually really convenient because you don't have to go pick it up as often. Of course, there's a piece of pipe here, so you know we got to see if it'll do the pipe thing. Yep, it'll do the pipe thing. Will it do the mound of dirt thing? Oh yeah, it does the mound of dirt thing pretty well too. It kind of looks like they made this ramp for me, so I'm not going to disappoint them. It just kind of chewed through the dirt instead of actually jumping the ramp. All right, I think we've pretty well proven that it can handle rough, sandy terrain pretty well. Let's go see how this thing really jumps. We've got the big boy tires on there now, and since we're testing the durability of the truck and not the durability of the body, I went ahead and put a beater body on there just to save that beautiful blue beast. Let's see how this thing jumps. They're lined up for the first jump, and we missed. That's okay. We're going to be testing the durability of this thing too. Go the other way. Not quite enough wheel speed. Let's see if it'll self-right. Yeah, I might need to up the gearing for that. Let's get her lined up and try that again. Oh gosh! Oh my gosh, that thing got so much air. I don't even know if that was still in frame. It also landed really smoothly. That return ramp's a little slippery in the morning. Let's see if we can get a backflip out of it. Oh yeah, easy backflip, the front flip. Wow! All right guys, I can easily say this thing is wild in the air. I don't think I've ever gotten that kind of height out of this ramp before. Double backflip. no problem. Still working on that landing control though. It's a good durability test. The air control on this thing is absolutely incredible, and it handles really well too. Big air. That is the most air I've ever gotten out of that ramp, and it lands absolutely dead flat. And this is what I remember from my original MT410 as well. It was just such a good handling car. Flat landing again. Let's see if we can get a little bit of a front flip out of her. This is probably going to end up being a durability test again. Or not. Yeah, the air control on this thing is absolutely unreal. Of course, some of that's going to have to do with the tires, some of that's going to have to do with the electronics, but it also has to do with the platform they're in. And as far as stunts are concerned, this thing is completely wild. I'm starting to get used to that front flip landing control. I think we could do backflip to front flip. Backflip to front flip, and landed it. This thing's getting so high, I'm not sure you guys are going to be able to see it on camera, but it is absolutely incredible off this ramp. One more jump. Beautiful. That front bumper really has taken a couple of hits so far, and it seems to be holding up well. The old front bumper would not have survived one of those hits. Now, speaking of surviving some hits, let's see what this thing does with some bad landings. Oh, right on the roof, and seems fine. It looks like the back end's squatting, but that's actually the body, not the car itself. The car's doing just fine. Go for another bad landing. Don't know what's gonna happen. Oh, right on the roof again. That's a good test of the strength of the chassis as well as the strength of the body mounts. A bad hit like that from high up can easily break a body mount. Let's see if we can hit something else. It likes to land on the roof. Trying to get it to hit an arm. The problem is it keeps jumping so flat that I can't get it sideways. That was kind of an arm, but not quite. This thing really does handle beautifully in the air, making it hard to test its durability. Oh, that was a hard hit. And yeah, it just took it. Even that plastic spur seems to be holding up well. Let's see how high we can get it. Oh, right off that front end. I'm gonna try and turn the wheels and see if we can get it to land sideways. Or a perfect 360 reverse landing. Let's try that again. I think we can get it to crash. Oh, that was right off one of the back arms. Let's try that one more time. Oh, it loves to land on its wheels. That's great. All right, one more good crash. Oh, off the back bumper. Guys, I am mostly very impressed with this thing. Before I show you what I like and what I don't like, let's talk about upgrades and cost. Since this is built on the 48 2.0 Tekno platform, there are a lot of Tekno upgrades that will definitely work with it. That includes things like the Tekno shock caps, the cross pins for the differential, and this servo arm. There are quite a few other 2.0 parts that are going to fit this, though there are also a lot of unique parts on this truck, so I'm not sure exactly which ones will or will not. There are some parts noted in the manual, but I know that's not an exhaustive list. Hopefully Tekno does give us a complete list of what works and what doesn't work. In the aftermarket, things like this M2C 2.0 Truggy chassis aren't going to work because it's just too long. This chassis is not the same as the Buggy or the Truggy, so a new chassis is going to have to be made for it, which I'm sure M2C will do. This aluminum Truggy rear brace also isn't going to work because the monster truck uses a double brace system, which is completely different. This truck does use standard 17mm hexes, so these M2C hex extenders are going to work. And because these shocks use the same 2.0 shock caps, these zero rebound caps from M2C should work as well. Unfortunately, neither of the Truggy shock towers are going to work. In the rear, it's much taller, and in the front, it's missing a bunch of mounting points. The first thing I'm not sure about are these upgraded shock standoffs, so let's find out. I didn't have any problems with the stock ones, but they might be weaker than the M2C option. All right, first of all, yep, it's going to fit just fine in the shock tower. And trying the shock on there, that also fits just fine. So these M2C upper shock standoffs will work. Their CVDs won't work because these are CVDs and this uses universals. Rear brace isn't going to work either, but this top support plate might. Let's find out. By the way, our custom carbon fiber center brace held up really nicely. And survey says Yep, that fits on there perfectly. Actually, scratch that. After screwing it down, I found it interferes with these arms that kick up a little bit, so this is gonna have to be modified as well. So clearly, even though a few things fit, the aftermarket's gonna have to do some work to make upgrades for this particular truck. Before we talk about what I like, what I don't like, and what I broke, let's talk about price. This kit's gonna be $550, but of course that doesn't include electronics, the body, or wheels and tires. How much you end up spending total is gonna be completely up to you. But if you spend $150 on a budget combo, say $40 on a reasonable servo, $50 on a body, $20 on a receiver, I'm gonna assume if you're building a kit, you probably already have a transmitter, and then another $60 on some wheels and tires, you're gonna be into this thing for around $900. That's a lot of money, but it's not really that far out of the range of all the other cars that are in this category. And you don't have to throw any parts away because you can put the motor, ESC, servo, body, and tires on it that you want. Is it worth that? Well, let's talk about what I broke. I bent this body pin, which is pretty impressive given that these body pins are probably the strongest in the industry. And to go along with that, I basically broke these two front body mounts. They are technically still holding on though, and these are as high as they can possibly go, so it's not 100% the mount's fault. Other than that, in spite of a bunch of really bad accidents from reasonably high up in the air, I didn't break anything else. Even the bumpers, which were a notorious weak point on the previous version, held up really well, and they took some hard hits. The chassis is still perfectly straight and was largely protected by the front and rear skid plates. And overall, based on a few packs of what I would consider medium reasonable bashing, it held up really, really well. There are very few things I don't like about it. The main one is that they don't include this tower-to-tower brace. I think it should come in the package. The battery tray is really designed to take standard length batteries, so it's going to be a bit limiting on those big 6S packs. And the way these electronics are laid out will limit you to about a 74mm max length on your motor can. Personally, I think these days you can get plenty of power out of a system like this, especially for a vehicle that's light. And given how this thing handles and jumps, I think this is a contender for Basher of the Year 2025. And I know you guys are Audience of the Year 2025, so why don't you join me in one of these videos?